friends, and welcome to Conversations for Expansion. I am your host today, Corey Hawkins, and today we are talking about EMDR. What's that you say? Let's find out. Today with me, I have two very special guests. We have Jillian Moon, LCSW. Hi, Jillian.
Hi.
And we have Chloe Renschler, also a licensed clinical social worker. Hi. Chloe. Thanks for being here. And they jointly own Touchstone Therapies LLC in Princeton, Indiana. I will post links below as to how to get in touch with them. I think they're also available through BetterHelp. Is that correct, ladies?
Mm-hmm. BetterHelp.
Yeah. So today we're talking about EMDR. It is my favorite mental health tool. And I think that everybody, everybody should go through some EMDR. But let's talk about what that is.
I suppose we should probably preface. We are EMDR trained. We're going through the certification process, but we are not through that certification process yet. I've been doing EMDR now. I've been trained for 4.5 years. You don't ever have to get certified if you don't want to. They like for you to put out there what you are and are not.
Okay.
What you are not. Don't you define yourself.
I understand. Who can tell me what EMDR stands for?
EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So it's a really long word. So everyone just shortens it to EMDR.
So EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprogramming. Is that correct?
Reprocessing.
Okay.
Reprocessing.
So that does describe like the way it works. So can you say more about how it works?
If you break it down, okay, so eye movement. The eye movements that you use are very quick back and forth eye movements. It's kind of been molded now where you can use other kinds of bilateral stimulation, but at its root, the eye movement is very quick back and forth movements intended to replicate your REM sleep. So when you are in your REM sleep, your brain is going through the process of moving memories from one place to another. Traumatic memories, though, get stuck and they don't process well. So by replicating that REM sleep and triggering your brain's natural processing state, you can actually reprocess traumatic memories that have not processed well on their own. The desensitization part plays in where it's much easier to think about certain memories because we can't erase them, but it's much easier to think about them. It's much easier to tolerate the feelings that are associated with those memories once you have desensitized yourself to that memory. It'll be triggered less. So there's a lot of benefits to that desensitization element of it.
Right, because a lot of times I think trauma, we have the traumatic experience, the initial experience, and then that trauma goes and attaches itself to current life situations. What does it look like when you're actually in doing this therapy? If you're the patient, what can you expect from it? What does it look like?
So I think it really depends on the therapist that you're working with, and it also depends on if you have any kind of underlying conditions. So let's say you have a seizure disorder. We cannot do eye stimulation with a seizure disorder. Some therapists like the buzzies. That's where you have two little buttons in your hand, basically, and they vibrate back and forth. Some therapists that, it's just standard eye movements and it's quick. So like if it's in front of you, it's bing, 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 really quickly. And there's a light bar, where it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a bar of light. It's probably about 3 feet long, and you stand in front of it, and it has green lights, and it goes back and forth, and you just trace eye movement with it. You can also expect to be a little tired afterward.
Yeah, that's been my experience, at least for the remainder of the day. I'm kind of just out of it, and I don't want to really engage. Like I'm processing. Leave me alone. Drink chocolate.
Yeah, and it's definitely one of those things where we have to consider that, especially with severe traumatic experiences, it's really common for people to report that they have repetitive nightmares about the experience. So you have to think, your brain's been trying to make sense of this for 100 different nights, and you're going to process a lot of it in an hour.
Yeah, it is really amazing how quickly you can process through stuff. And that's part of what sold me on EMDR. So I like the buzzies. My therapist calls them paddles. because my preference is to be able to close my eyes. I have dysfunction with my eyes, so I don't think I can follow the quickness of that movement, but I like to be able to close my eyes, because when I'm in that, I can literally like see. I'm a very visual person, so I can see like these scenes, kind of play out in my head. It's really quite interesting. Okay, so when somebody decides that they're going to try out this EMDR, how do you narrow down what to work on? When I go to talk therapy and talk to my therapist, it's a lot of talking, right? But the EMDR is really, it's a focused therapy. So what do you do to help patients find their focus for this therapy?
So what we do, it actually kind of connects to what you said a minute ago about how trauma attaches itself to recent events. So what your therapist is looking for is kind of a common denominator in a lot of the things that you're expressing concern about. I'm going to use a really generic example. If what you find is that there's a large number of the things in your day-to-day life are making you feel not good enough, your therapist is then going to help you target map those experiences. You're going to talk about the things in your present that are making you feel not good enough. Like I ask my clients, I say, okay, now follow that feeling for me. When have you felt this before? And so what your brain is going to do is it's actually going to follow that neural pathway that has been developed based on that feeling. And it's going to trace back. Sometimes it'll bounce around. Sometimes it'll go in a very linear fashion, slowly creep back in time. Everyone's brains work a little bit differently on that. But you'll find that you have a series of experiences likely that have made you feel the same way over and over and over again. And as that's happened, it has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And we're going to work all the way back to what is called your touchstone, which touchstone therapy, shameless plug, right? So you're going to work back to your touchstone. And so your touchstone is what we kind of consider the root. Where did this negative belief, this negative cognition originate? This pathway is all kind of leading back to there. If you make a small mistake in your day-to-day life, but you have this huge negative reaction to it, what we're talking about is the fact that your neural pathway is traveling all the way back to this really significant touchstone, the significant root. And it's going to look different for different therapists. Different therapists are trained differently. A lot of times the way I start it is I'll say, okay, tell me something this week that made you feel not good enough. And it's kind of going to be our lead. And I'm going to say, okay, picture that, picture what you felt, picture what you saw, picture, get as much into your senses as you can. And I'm going to say, okay, go with that. And I'm going to start the eye movements. What you're going to find is that people's minds will take them where they need to go. That eye movement will trigger your brain to start processing down that neural pathway that we've kind of set it on. Some people will start at the touchstone, or if you have a certain event that's really, really bothering you that week, you can certainly start there. I don't think there's one right and one wrong way to do it. I think it's, again, you're going to have different therapists with different styles. You're going to have different clients with different needs. Some clients, if you ask them to start at their touchstone that very first time they try EMDR, a lot of clients, if you ask them to do that, you would probably never see them again. Because it's a very emotional process. I give the metaphor of like EMDR is ripping off the therapy Band-Aid. Talk therapy picks it off. But a lot of people aren't ready for that rip yet, but we're going to help you get ready for it. We're going to prepare you mentally, physically, emotionally for that. But it's an emotional process, but it's a faster process.
It definitely makes a difference. How you're trained, who trains you, and when you receive the training. They update this stuff all the time. The original method is eye movement, and now they're updating it to where they're saying there's all kinds of different bilateral, that's what they call it. The back and forth is bilateral stimulation. I've had clients where I think it was more of a problem of felt like they're being looked at in those moments, and they wanted to close their eyes and do tapping on the knees back and forth. And it kind of just depends on preference, but it also depends your style and how you go at it. Definitely depends on, are we talking about a single traumatic event? Are we talking about acute post-traumatic stress disorder? Are we talking about complex post-traumatic stress disorder? Because you're going to see a lot of differences in how things present. With chronic PTSD, this isn't a one experience. They have an entire childhood of experiences. So I may go at it at a different angle. And in those cases, me and Joe were really fortunate to go to a EMDR training just 6 months ago, like a more advanced training. And they discussed the idea of desensitization versus integration. With complex PTSD, there's more of a level of having to fully integrate the complexity of those experiences rather than just desensitize the memory.
And when I go in, I just tell my therapist, like, here's what's in my way. I don't want to be seen, or I'm afraid to speak my truth, or I'm afraid of confrontation, or I'm bad at setting boundaries, or I'm overweight. I mean, this is a conversation her and I have had because when I was very young, I experienced food scarcity. So, you know, like these are the things that I go in with and I say, all right, this is what I want to focus on. And there are times where it's like, boom, 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 I can roll through it. I do the paddles and I go way back. And then there are other times, you know, it's like, you know, going through the bin of cables that my husband has out in the garage where they're all like tangled up and hard to discern from one another. And those therapies are much more difficult. But I tell you what, even in just the year, Jillian was saying it's fast. Like I've been thinking psychologically for as long as I can remember. I not opposed to therapy, but I didn't want to go do talk therapy because I didn't want to hear it anymore. Like I've already said these words, I'm sick to death of hearing myself talk about it. Just the progress that I've made in the last year of being able to let go stuff, it's just fantastic. I am a huge fan. I think that something that I'd like to touch on is this concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. I think people have stigmas when it comes to PTSD, or they have preconceived notions as to what that looks like, because I was like, no, I don't have PTSD. I mean, I went through stuff. I pulled myself up. I'm fine. I've survived and everything is all good. But now, you know, I have a different framework for what PTSD is. And I'm like, yeah, that was pretty traumatic stuff that I went through. And then it compounded for the rest of my life because I developed behaviors based on this sense of surviving this trauma, right? So can you guys shed any different light to what PTSD might look like for people, and kind of like open it up so that people can access the help that they can get for this disorder?
PTSD is such a complex diagnosis that despite the number of times that I've seen people with complex trauma who are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, I can't sit here and list off the criteria to you because there are so many ways that it can manifest. So really, PTSD can look 100% different in two people who have it because they could have extremely different symptomology of the same disorder. I think the stigma or the stereotype that you picture in post-traumatic stress disorder is like the angry war veteran. Am I right? Like, I think that shell shock is where PTSD was first noticed, right? It was called shell shock. They noticed people coming back from war with all kinds of anger issues or like difficulty expressing, going blank. That was a big one, going blank. What we now know is that they were dissociating, which is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. Dissociation is probably a whole other topic that you could talk for hours upon hours about because it's such a huge spectrum. But dissociation is any attempt that your brain makes to pull itself from reality. I think we all force dissociate a little bit with our phones. Like, oh, I would rather not think about this super stressful thing. Let me sit on Pinterest for an hour. So even slightly like that's it. I mean, you're still in reality, but you're trying to pull your brain out of a stressful situation. So that's the light end of it. The far extreme end of dissociation, you have dissociative identity disorder. That's where people they've dissociated so much that they've created alternate personalities. Well, you could probably spend a whole other hour talking about that too. But so you can see where even in one symptom, it can look very different within different people. But most of it's probably somewhere in the middle. Those are like the 0 and 100. Most of it's going to be somewhere in between that. Sometimes people describe it like watching a situation happen as opposed to feeling like they're living it, like they're watching themselves live a situation and not feeling it. Sometimes people describe being pulled out of reality for they exist, but they're not a part of reality. So those are all different ways dissociation can manifest. You have a lot of flashbacks where people feel like they are back living a situation. So if you hear, and again, the stereotype of that is the veteran who hears fireworks, right? Research surrounds veterans because they're easy to find. We know what they've been through. We know it was traumatic. It's not subjective. It was, so it's really, that's where a lot of our understanding comes from and why it comes that way. But that can look like anger outbursts. It can look like crying fits. People are just they feel like they're reliving a situation, but you're going to see something very different depending on what that person is reliving. You're going to see things like nightmares, recurrent nightmares. A lot of times you'll see the same nightmare over and over again. It doesn't always have to be about that specific event, but usually the content of the dream feels the same. Again, that negative cognition is the same. Irritability, withdrawal from people, hopelessness. There's a long list of symptoms. People have to hit at least one or two or three of each different kind of category, depending on the category. Like, it's a super complex diagnosis. In real life, what it looks like is everybody who has PTSD deals with it a little differently.
I think where it all gets confused is in the word trauma. I think we all have our own perception of what that word means. Like Joe was saying, with war, there's no arguing that is a traumatic experience. That's a direct threat to life. And I think everybody knows, any kind of physical abuse, sexual abuse, violence, things of that nature. But really, trauma is anything that our brain perceives to exceed our ability to cope. So if our brain found something to be so stressful that we didn't have the ability to cope, that is trauma. And then we get into the realm of psychological abuse, emotional abuse, intellectual abuse, spiritual abuse, which are things that are not talked about as much because we're a little blood washed as a society. It doesn't jar us, then we don't really think of it in that way. But I think that's where people struggle to identify with post-traumatic stress, is that the understanding of the word trauma. And you were talking about dissociation. To have PTSD, you actually don't even have to have dissociation. Most people tend to force dissociation in some way if they don't do it involuntarily. Sometimes that's drugs or alcohol, high-risk behaviors. On the more subtle scale for the average person, being quickly triggered by something. If something scares you, a heightened startle response. Anyone that has some type of trauma history, if your husband's, you think they sneak up behind you, well, they didn't sneak up behind you. They just walked into the kitchen, but you jump. And that can be, not for everyone, but a symptom of traumatic stress. You can get some exaggerated beliefs about the world. I'm not safe if I'm alone. Mm-hmm. Or it's not safe to be outside, or my car is not safe. So it gets kind of into some black and white thinking. Sleep disturbance in general, it can even go into insomnia, where we're not sleeping at all because we don't feel safe. A lot of times PTSD or trauma-related disorders do get kind of pushed into an anxiety disorder category, or they get pushed into a depressive disorder category, because these symptoms mimic PTSD. They kind of do this.
As I'm listening to you guys, it's talking about, how they use veterans and soldiers most often for this. I think that because that's the case, a lot of ordinary people look and say, well, those guys, they deserve to, to get treated for this. I just had a parent that yelled too loud too often, or, I got bit by a dog. That's not nearly as bad as going to war. So it's like people minimize their own experience of trauma in relationship to the origins of, this PTSD treatment.
Yeah, I literally actually just wrote that down, that I was going to piggyback off something Chloe said, jumped my mind to. I just had a session today where, we're kind of processing through this guy's trauma, trauma being the key word there, right? And he's like, I just, I think of all these people who've been abused, and I think of all these other things that have happened to people, and I just don't feel like I should feel this bad about it. And I say two things there. I said, well, first is, it doesn't matter if you should or shouldn't, because you do. So we put a lot of should and shouldn'ts on our feelings, and they're irrelevant. But the second piece of that is that your brain only understands things for the sake of comparison. Your brain understands when it's hot outside because it's been cold outside. Your brain understands when, up versus down. It understands things relative to your other experiences. My brain does not understand that it's hot outside because Chloe's brain has felt that it's cold outside. So our emotional brains do not understand my hot versus Chloe's cold. They understand my hot versus my cold. And so when people get into, oh, well, of course a veteran has trauma, but I shouldn't feel this bad because my life was not that bad. Kind of, going back to Chloe's definition of trauma, is if it exceeded your ability to cope, if it exceeded your too hot and your too cold, that's all that matters. And that's what we're treating. We will make sure that, your brain comes back within that window of tolerance of what's too hot for you and what's too cold for you, and let those other people deal with their traumas.
When you were talking about dissociation earlier, one of the things that occurred to me recently within the past 6 months or so, my therapist said to me, you're really good at describing your feelings. And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, yeah, it's like you're really good at, it's like you're not even feeling them. You're just talking about them. And I'm like, yeah. And that's part of why I think, looking back, why talking has never really been therapeutic to me, is because it is like an intellectual activity versus the actual processing of my emotions. And I thought that was an interesting thing. And she said, yeah, that's a product of dissociation. You have thought yourself out of your feelings. I'm like, well, that's interesting. And I think a lot of people do that. I don't think that's very uncommon. So is there anything else you guys want to say about EMDR as a therapy, or why would you recommend it?
The time that I recommend it for clients is when they're in that space of, I know something to be true, but it doesn't feel true. I know that I am good enough, but I do not feel good enough. I know that I am safe, but I do not feel safe. And so kind of like goes back to what you were saying, like, I know these are my feelings, or I know that this is all going on, but I'm not feeling. I think clients do best in EMDR when we can bring them to that space, or even if they come in that space, maybe they've done a lot of talk therapy before that has brought them to that space. Like, I know I'm safe. I can look around and see that I'm safe, but I still don't feel it. So that processing helps you, that emotional brain, meet your logical brain where it's at.
EMDR is really useful for a lot of different disorders too. I think most of the research with it is related to post-traumatic stress. I think, like Jill was saying, getting those study groups together is a little easier that way. But you can also use EMDR to help treat addiction, to help treat chronic pain is something that they're looking into, because there's a huge correlation between early adverse childhood experiences and chronic pain conditions, like adult onset chronic pain conditions. So they're using EMDR in a lot of different ways. We're targeting that core cognition of self. So let's say somebody's struggling in addiction, I would almost guarantee there's a core cognition of self. And even if it's traced back to things that, they wouldn't typically think of as adverse, well, we need to start working on changing that negative cognition of self to something more positive. I think it really helps to instill hope into people, and a hope that they feel, like what Jill was saying, not a hope that we know, it's a hope that we feel.
It's interesting that my experience of EMDR, my therapist doesn't require me to say anything. She's like, tell me what you need to tell me based on your experience. But there's definitely things that I have not vocalized to her that were I'm not ready. That's way too personal. So, and that was part of the appeal for me getting started, was that it was like, we picked a target. We went through the process, and she's like, your brain is going to start showing you pictures, or you're going to experience things. And she's like, you tell me as much of it as you need to, because I knew walking in there, for me to be able to have effective talk therapy, I'd have to be able to vocalize these things. And I first had to be able to have the experience myself. Do you know what I mean? It was it was almost like a strangely safe space, even though it was huge. It was majorly an intimate moment. What do you feel like the psychological climate is right now? Got any thoughts about what's happening with this pandemic and things?
People are stressed. People are scared. Things are changing in a very rapid way, in a very startling way. Finances, big things in family dynamics include money. So when money becomes uncertain, that really starts upping the ante of stress. Kids being out of school and being home and doing e-learning, it's affecting everybody. I'm hoping that everyone's asking and looking for help that needs it. I think just given the climate, just a lot of anxiety, you know. I mean, this is a traumatic experience. This is a global pandemic. This is trauma. People are losing loved ones every day. We're talking about PTSD, threats to life. That's a huge, this is a direct threat to every one of our lives. That's trauma. It's to be expected. I think the mental health field's a little overwhelmed with the influx. I kind of expected to have less clients just because of financial instabilities and things of that nature. But, you know, things like BetterHelp, they make it more affordable.
One of the things that I've been bringing up to people who are feeling like a lot of isolation or depression right now, when I was in college, I did a report on this part of your brain called the fusiform face area. And I will never forget that, the fusiform face area. So the fusiform face area is the part of your brain that is programmed to constantly like scan your environment for faces. And it's why you see like faces in cars. You know how you're like, that car looks angry. Like you project an emotion onto an inanimate object because of the face that you perceive that it's making, right? So that part of your brain rewards you when you see a face. It reacts differently. It's like, oh, good, a person. Oh, good. And, you know, that's a survival instinct, right? We're a social species. We're constantly trying to be part of a social group. And we're trying to understand, that's why one car looks happy versus one car looks sad, right? We're trying to understand emotion from those faces, and that part of your brain is responsible for decoding that. But what it also does is every time you see a face, you get a little chemical reward. Your brain is like, oh good, that's nice. And so those bit by bit, those add up. Well, when you take faces away from people, when people stop seeing other faces, they stop getting those small rewards. So chemically even, I mean, if you look at depression on a completely chemical level, which I don't look at it that way for the most part, but if you did, if you boiled it right down to a completely chemical level, your brain is a little more depressed because it's getting less rewards that way. So I've been pointing that out to a lot of people, like it's not good for, and even like half faces, we're really only seeing half faces, right? It's really not good for our brains. We're a social species, and it's not good for our brains to go into isolation. So, you know, Zooming versus voice calling is a really good, make sure you're seeing faces. But I think that lack thereof is kind of fueling some depression and isolation.
I don't like going to the grocery store and like, you know, because I'm a smiler. I'm like, you know, a smiler. Like, so nobody can see. I'm like, I'm smiling hard with my eyes. Can you see me? Nobody can see me. I don't feel acknowledged for my smiles. This pandemic in many ways has put people in the bell jar. Do you know what that means? Do you know what the bell jar is?
No.
Bell jar is a scientific instrument, and it's, you know, those glass domes that have like a kind of knobby handle on top, and you put it on top of your subject and you suck all the air out of it and create a vacuum. I kind of feel like this pandemic for a lot of people, if they were in a situation in their lives that didn't work to begin with, that this put them in the bell jar about it. It's sucking the oxygen out. It's making it more like, okay, I really have to deal with this now. Or, and, you know, in the face of that, I can see that leading to a lot of escapist behaviors. But my hope is that, and I don't know if it's just the crowds that I run in, but I've seen a change in the way people look at mental health. Like it's becoming less stigmatic for you to go to therapy. And I hope that this pandemic boosts that. I hope more people are like, okay, you know what? We're all in this traumatic experience together. Let's all get some help, because I think moving out of this, we have the potential as a species, as a society to advance. And, you know, I think part of that is looking at the dark spots, the trauma that we have to process as a race, never mind as individuals. So well, thanks, ladies, for joining me today. It was a good conversation. I highly recommend everybody does EMDR, because in my opinion, if you're a human being, you've experienced trauma. Good luck with your new business. I'm so excited for you. So until next time, I'm Corey Hawkins. Take really good care of yourself. And as always, take good care of your plants.